Why, hello, Full Indie. I am KATHRYN. My morning present for you is this TNG GIF. Really, TNG GIF, solid way to start any day, but this one is particularly dear to me. For the discerning eye, you may recognize this as that clip from the Next Generation episode where Picard learns an alien dialect where they only speak in metaphor. This episode is weird and experimental and wonderful, and by the end of it, it messes with your mind, and you also kind of understand this alien dialect. So this is the pinnacle scene where Picard is throwing down his alien metaphors, and then dreamy Data is reacting. Anyway, little did I know when I first saw this masterpiece that it would become shorthand for my approach to game design. So I am here to invite you into my favorite corner of weird and intimate play, language. First, a proper introduction. I am 50% of Thorny Games. That's an indie studio out of San Francisco. We specialize in tabletop and live action games about language and cryptography. That may sound niche, and you would not be wrong. So I'm a big believer in making games to find your people. The internet is a very big place, and most of the time its targeting algorithms are used to ill effect, but they also help us find like-minded folks who are similarly niche. I am a computational linguist by love and training, and sort of unsatisfied with a healthy separation in life. When I became a game maker, I naturally needed to smash my passions together, and so here we are. At Thorny Games, language is a central mechanic in all of our games, and a lens for telling nuanced stories about people. So as a studio, we've walked this road for a few years. We've had some early successes to date, and have really been surprised and humbled by the enthusiasm that we've seen for language-focused games, let alone language-focused tabletop and live-action games. So in particular, our tabletop RPG Dialect, a game about language and how it dies, was successful on Kickstarter, and then recently finished shipping out about 5,000 physical copies, which is a big deal for tabletop. Whew, may there be many more. So we were also named finalists at Indiecade in 2017 for another game, Sign, which has been played the world over. All of this is really just to say that we think that there's something captivating in these topics. It resonates with enough folks for us to continue to do what we do, and we're excited to explore more. So, why play in this way? Why is language special? Language is innate to us as humans. It's fundamental to how our brains work, how we structure thought, how we convey ourselves to one another. We're kind of built for it. And when you play with language, you're kind of tinkering with your own internal clockwork. And that's super exciting. Like, animals don't quite do it, androids don't quite do it, but we are excellent at it. And just me constructing this sentence is a tiny miracle, especially at this time in the morning. Machine intelligence can humble us in so many ways, but the machine still cannot have a semi-convincing conversation, so we have that going. Doing things that you're really good at is fun. Language is kind of leaning into our own excellence. Also, it's an amazing canvas for play. We've been punning, crosswording, metaphoring really since time immemorial. But most interesting to me is that language is a window into identity and culture. It's a reflection of what we are, our interface to the world really in each other, and how we communicate defines and reinforces just our shared values and perspectives in a big way. So just from how I talk, you can tell a lot about me. Kind of West Coasty, millennial, and even if you pay a little more attention, you may discern that, originally a Valley girl, she probably knows her way around a mall. But many shades of who I am are reflected in my speech. A lot of this understanding of language is pretty latent in all that it codes for, so it's kind of like the water that we're swimming in. It's all around us, but there's a lot going on beyond our awareness, so it's kind of neat to look below the surface and marvel at it. So now, the punchline. Language is a powerful tool for games. It is worthy of a place in your design toolbox. It's something that your players are great at, and it's just a raw way of stirring emotion, provoking empathy, and kind of evoking feeling. So if you like telling nuanced stories about people, there is a ton to unpack here. So come with me on a very tiny and incomplete tour. I'm just gonna throw a bunch of games at you. A lot of them kind of obscure word tabletop, but you seem down for it, so I'm excited for that. Let's frame this journey through the ways that games and media use language for impact. So some of these are super obvious and some are a bit more subtle. We'll name a few, and then focus here will be on language as a mechanic in service of story. So, as game makers, we are world builders. Language is a way to give kind of depth and dimension to a setting. It really makes a world feel alive. It kind of grounds history, people, culture. The apex of this, obviously Tolkien, kind of need to acknowledge the altar here. Languages were the root of Middle Earth, Elvish, Quenya, Sindarin, all of that. But they were used as architecture for really one of the most famous fantasy worlds that there is. But plenty of games use language in service of world building. The Myst series was my first exposure to this with the Dani language, kind of sprinkled throughout. I remember stumbling across it in Riven, an amazing moment in my childhood. But even if you aren't directly interacting with it, it really ups immersion. It makes the world feel lived in, and adds to this kind of creeping satisfaction that you two have fallen through the book. You can also imagine just a super simple dabbling of language matched to a game setting that does a lot to fill in the detail. Simlish, that makes the world of The Sims kind of feel lived in and functioning, even when the player isn't looking. That's not a full language in the sense of some of these other things, and it's really kind of silly, but it accomplishes something real and important here. Cool, language is action. Rituals, pledges, prayers, ceremonies, that is a way of using words to actually mark a change in state or to bring about some outcome, and games are totally rife with this. On one side, in the completely not so subtle camp, take Sorry as a game. No one would care about this game if it wasn't for the ritual of sarcastically saying sorry when you screw over your friends and then send them back to start. It is why this game sells. It is the name on the box, and that is where the fun is. And so mechanizing that way of saying sorry is really encouraging people to be sassy and release a bit of tension and then kind of lean into that sweet revenge. In the more profound camp, let me tell you a little bit about this role-playing game called 10 Candles. So this is a game where you tell a story of creeping horror through this large sequence of rituals. Scenes are based around putting out candles, burning cards, and then reciting these ritual phrases to sort of lend weight to the story as light is drowned from the world. And language as action is a core mechanic as part of the rules, where certain phrases have to be recited at distinct points in order to mark a state and change. So for example, after a round of players kind of incrementally adding more detail into what's going on in this world, each of the sessions must begin with the phrase, all said entirely in unison, "These things are true, the world is dark." Super atmospheric, and a way of kind of collectively opting in to this new fiction that's been set. Language is constraint. There's so much fruitful design space in constraint and restriction, and then applying that to language really encourages a particular kind of creativity. For example, a game like Codenames, where you have to communicate hidden patterns to your partner efficiently without kind of matching cards that you shouldn't. Or Dixit, this is another great tabletop game where you walk this fine line between being too obvious and too obscure. So in the game, you come up with these little phrases about cards and only want to communicate something to a subset of players. You have to broadcast it to everybody. When I play games in general, I love surprising myself with my own wit and cleverness. And navigating language under constraint is just a really cool way of impressing yourself with the mental leaps that you can make. So to ramp this up even further, you can imagine restricting language entirely while still asking players to communicate pretty sophisticated things. This is a good time to talk about some of our games at Thorny Games. So this is our game Sign, which is based on the true story of Nicaraguan Sign Language. Don't worry, I will tell it to you. So this is a language that was born in modern times, so like late 1970s, where deaf children without any native language were brought together and spontaneously created their own through play. So this is a true and remarkable thing, and kind of the seeds of this experience are within each of us. As you can imagine, constraint on language is fundamental to signs design. So to explain a bit more about how it works, in it we all play as children that are brought together on their first day of school. You have a background, personalities, goals, things that you want to communicate to other people. But the game is entirely silent. No established forms of language. Rules are distributed at various points through cards, but the core mechanic here is improvised sign. And the trick of constraint is that players are given very, very few opportunities to unambiguously define new language. So it's really up to them to start inventing variants and bending and molding words to do what they want to do. And so as a designer, we kind of let players take themselves on this journey to be understood. We take their language away from them and then let them reclaim it piece by piece. And then in the end, players make up this kind of proto-sign language in tribute to the original story and have fun along the way. Language as conflict. So yeah, language can offer really different and intriguing mechanics for resolving conflict. Monkey Island, love that game, uses insult sword fighting in a way that makes the action of sword fighting fit the overall humorous tone of the game. You kind of subvert how you'd normally think about a sword fighting mechanic. You spar with your words. And another really interesting example of this is the tabletop RPG Magicians. So Magicians uses language as a conflict resolution mechanic to teach you magic, aka Korean, while you play. In that game, you are students at this magical academy, and to cast spells, you actually have to pronounce words in a way that the speech transcription feature on your phone correctly interprets your Korean pronunciation. So it's pretty metal. So language can also be used to explore a setting. It's full of patterns, connections, layered meaning, and so deciphering this internal logic can be a super satisfying way for players to discover a world. So in Sethian, the core conceit is that you're discovering this abandoned alien terminal in another language that you then decode as the game goes on. And in the upcoming Heaven's Vault, you play this archaeologist on an alien planet who then deciphers the language of the culture that you discover over the course of the game. So both of these examples are really pointed instances of exploring kind of fictional language that is itself part of a world. But what if the thing that you are exploring is also created by the players during the game? And with that, let's talk about dialect, our tiny but mighty game about language and how it dies. This is a tabletop role-playing game where you tell the story of an isolated community by building their language at the table. So you track the rise and fall of a group of people over the course of a single game session. So words end up being built off of these fundamental traits of the community that you collaboratively define, pivotal events that happen to them, and ultimately how they respond to a changing world. So the game's core spark comes from gradually building up elements of language among players who then gain fluency in a dialect that they are creating over the course of play. In each turn, players will define new words, start using them as they role-play members of the isolation. Things happen to the community, the language shifts, and then becomes more layered to reflect it. And so in doing so, players kind of are discovering the essence of these people together, defining it live, and the dialect that they make becomes a map of what has happened to them. I'll take a moment to highlight some insights and challenges in our encounters with language-centric play, by focusing on dialect in particular. So There are three components that really need to be in harmony in dialect to work, and really in any story-focused game that is dealing with language. Fundamentally, the language needs to be sound and in the spotlight. That's the heart of what is made together and anchors the culture. The story of what ultimately happens to these people in their beginning, rise, and end. But language and story are in something of a feedback loop here. Like, they feed into one another, so language begets story, begets language, and so on. Characters are a key part of this. Like, you actually need to role play in order to make the story and the language come alive. By saying words aloud that you're creating, you are actually affirming the truth in the world that you're building. So what about language and dialect worked well? First, it's a really stealthy way of connecting players to both the story and each other. Like, co-creation in general that's a moving experience just on its own, but there's something really special when it's captured in a word. You are creating your own language and like code for your in-group, and that's just a great way of accelerating intimacy. Language is sticky. People remember words that they made like long after the game is finished. I still use words that I've built with people kind of years later when I encounter them in unconventional settings, and it just immediately invokes the story that we told and takes us right back to the table. It also straddles this diegetic, non-diegetic line. So dialect does something neat in that while a language is being spoken in the game universe, it's also being created in the real world by the players at the table. So that means that after players have told the story of this endangered dialect that is lost, by the end of the game, they are also the sole speakers of the dialect they have just created. And that parallel between kind of story and the real world can just lead to really interesting bleed between the two spaces and kind of sticks with you. There is plenty that is hard and tricksy here too. I'll cover a couple things briefly. Pacing is a challenge when you are so closely marrying language and story. So when you define a language piece by piece, you really need to keep it in sync with the story. So that means a natural and common word. If we have a particular variant for it, like friend, kind of changing halfway through, the game can feel jarring. And anything with language, because we have so much intuition built around it, can elicit this almost subconscious, visceral reaction that something is off. Another is that it can be mentally taxing to go it alone. So building new words is fun, but you don't want to do it in a vacuum. Players need lots of prompts and connections to kind of jumpstart this process. We ended up actually mechanizing cooperation as part of the turn. So we decided to co-op parts of our turn structure so that players aren't left on their own. And then lastly, I'll call out this character complexity with role-playing. In role-play in general, in many tabletop story games, you're kind of navigating constantly between first person and third person, especially if there's in-character stuff. Role-playing is key for making this language feel alive, but that means that you're spending time in this third-person scenario where you're building the world and the language, and at the same time acting in it. So that is necessary for immersion, but tricky. So it's been a journey to make the kind of games that we want to play and that deals so intimately with language. But we love it, and there's so much richness here, and we feel like that we're just getting started to seeing its power. So let me leave you with, language is an amazing tool for game design. It offers a complex and nuanced view of identity. So if you like telling stories about people, it too might be your jam. It is good and true and will make your games better. So thanks a bunch.